Okay, it's recorded, so the floor is yours, Daniel.
Thank you, Fabrice, and welcome to everyone to this third webinar in a series of 6 webinars that we are holding this week as part of a Space Live Talks event. This event is co-organized by IBAN Space, so it's the European Business Angel Networks, and New Space Capital. New Space Capital is a Luxembourg-based investment fund that invests into growth stage companies in the space sector. And so we're here on the third one. The topic of today is the market perspective and trends across the industry during and after COVID-19. And I must say we had already 2 very interesting discussions just an hour ago and yesterday. The first one was more about sort of a business perspective to see where there is resilience, is there doomsday, or where are the opportunities? And just an hour ago, we got the perspective of investors. And I think in general terms, what we observe is that obviously there is concerns, there is question marks about how everything will develop. And I think it was the speaker was making the point, maybe the worst from an investment point of view is only 6 to 12 months ahead, when maybe capital will dry out because of the uncertainty. But at the same time, I think it's also a clear message from everybody that we spoke to so far. It's not a doomsday scenario. Management, companies are more prepared. And so the hope is that we will sort of venture through this crisis much better than maybe in previous situations. I myself, I'm Daniel Biedermann. I spent most of my career in the space industry, mainly in the launcher and SATCOM sectors. And I'm currently working as an independent advisor on the space ecosystem matters, supporting, amongst other things, New Space Capital, but I'm also working on projects with the Luxembourg Space Agency. And today I'm very pleased to have in this webinar 2 distinguished guests, and I would consider true subject matter experts on the space industry topics. So let me start with Claude Rousseau from Northern Sky Research, otherwise also known as NSR, which is a global leader in satellite and space market research and consulting services. So Claude is based in Strasbourg in France and has more than 25 years experience in the sector. Claude is a research director at NSR, where he serves as regional applications experts and directs both multi-client research reports and consulting projects. He oversees and conducts market research in all domains of the space ecosystem. And I'm therefore very much looking forward to hearing your insights, Claude. So Claude graduated from the University of Calgary with a BSc in physics and astrophysics, and from the International Space University in France with a master in space studies, where he's currently also an adjunct professor in business and management. So welcome, Claude, to this webinar.
Thank you for having me, Daniel. A pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So the second speaker I would like to introduce is Nihar Shah, which is an old friend and former working colleague of mine. So Nihar is based in Washington, D.C., and he leads the strategy and market intelligence activities at SES, which is one of the leading SATCOM operators and service providers. His team is responsible for SES corporate strategic planning, as well as market, competitive, and customer research and analysis. Nihar was part of the team that evaluated the investment into O3b, the medium Earth orbit constellation, and has helped define SES' successful diversification strategy to become a global network service provider. So Nihar holds a BA in economics, an MA in Masters in International Space and Technology Policy from George Washington University, and an MBA from Georgetown. Again, very much looking forward to get your insights. Welcome, Nihar.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for the opportunity.
So maybe last things on intro. Please, could all participants, except the speakers, or switch their cameras off and also put their microphones on mute so that we can have a noise-free zone for the speakers. And also there is, as you know, a chat function available on Zoom. So if you have questions during the session, please use the chat function. And we will try to cover as many questions as we can during the session. So with much further ado, let's dive into the subjects. And maybe I would like to start with a question more sort of from a helicopter view perspective. And maybe let's start with you, Claude, and then have Nihar also give his thoughts about this. So the question is, so which sectors of the space ecosystem do you think have gained actually importance during COVID-19? And are there also losers in all this? And do you think that landscape will stay like that after COVID-19, or will it rebalance back to the old normal?
Thank you, Daniel. Great question. Difficult to actually peg, but we did a survey end of March, early April, after all this was actually, going towards a peak of, let's say, the pandemic in Europe. And there was a lot of feeling at that time that because things looked like they were all stopped, that everybody basically would be, losing. However, certain factors led to, for example, higher take-up in broadband access, as we know, for both consumer and enterprise, but a little less, enterprise was a bit more difficult because some enterprises, some companies, some offices were shutting down. So that led actually to a bit of a lull in that demand. But definitely, broadband connectivity, we think, has gained importance. If we look at other aspects of looking at the pandemic, the Earth observation and imagery market, we also noticed, has gained traction recently because the ability, of course, to remotely look at what's going on in the world and look at different locations because people can't travel. So I guess they prefer to have a view of what's going on. And it's important for enterprises and governments as well. In terms of losses, anything that's got to do with transportation has really been impacted quite a lot. Aero, maritime, energy as well, as we saw, because less use of oil and gas because you don't need transportation as much. So therefore, that activity has gone down quite severely, and thus the importance of communicating and connectivity to those platforms has been severely impacted. If we look at the what will happen? Will we go back to an old normal? We think all these transportation modes eventually will rebalance, but at different paces, each of them, because of course of restrictions on travel. But I think broadband access, and another one that I haven't mentioned, but probably Nihar knows a lot about this one, is the backhaul one. The backhaul one, we think, to support broadband connectivity will remain and will have a large upside going forward.
Thanks very much, Claude. Any additions maybe from your side, Nihar?
So hope you can all hear me. Thanks. I would generally agree with connect.
You're breaking up, Nihar.
I hope you can all hear me. Yeah, I think I would generally portfolio business that spans many different aspects of the industrial chain. And so when we speak about space, you have, your downstream, your upstream, and you have various different applications. So I think, space being such a broad portfolio business has a lot of resiliency and depth. And of course, there are going to be some winners and some losers in the situation. But I think we should look at how the situation plays out over the long term before assigning that, because of course things will eventually come back. But that being said, definitely, the applications that serve, essentially are collaborative in nature, broadband being the sort of the lifeblood of that connectivity, whether it's backhaul, whether it's enterprise, whether it's consumer, whether it's resiliency, whether it's government communications, specifically for some of the, tactical field operations that most countries have launched to support the medical emergency during the coronavirus. These have all obviously shown great resiliency and great uptake. I mean, I think network traffic, I should say, is roughly up 30 to 40% across various infrastructures. So that's good. And as we go forward in this post-crisis world, government stimulus for funding will put broadband back on the map as a more prominent. Sure, all citizens, all businesses, all organizations have access. So the industry will benefit from that. And clearly then on the other side, we all know that those things that are in the mobility business, hospitality, entertainment, travel, transportation, energy, these are impacted segments in the current circumstances. There's no getting around that. Planes are not flying, cruise ships are not sailing, oil rigs are cold stacking. So there's that impact, which is, I would say, in the loser category. But again, some of these businesses are quite fundamental. I don't see them completely being eviscerated. They will come back, maybe smarter, maybe a bit smaller in their footprint, but more efficient, and that gives more opportunities for the industry to reinvent itself.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, Nihar. So maybe just a technical point. Maybe your bandwidth seems to be fluctuating a little bit. So I don't know. Maybe you're better off. Not that we don't want to see you, but maybe you're better off switching off the camera. Maybe you get a bit more bandwidth.
I'll try to maybe move also. Just a second.
So since it seems that there's quite a lot of things going around the SATCOM market, and maybe we come back to other segments of the space sector and ecosystem in a minute. But let me maybe drill down a little bit deeper into the SATCOM industry, and maybe I'll leave that to Nihar to start with. So, I mean, now for years, with vertical integration, with LEO constellations, and all these projects that have surged, high throughput satellites, and so on. So the SATCOM industry was already considered somehow in transition prior to COVID-19. So will this, and some call it transition, some call it disruption. So what's your view now with this COVID-19 situation? Will this transition or disruption accelerate, or will it be the same? And how will the sector look like in maybe, let's say, 2 to 3 years out, if you had a crystal ball?
That's a good question. I think that's on the minds of most of the CEOs of the satellite companies. So I think, the way I would describe it is that the satellite industry, I mean, now I'm talking about obviously the communication satellite industry, was certainly in a situation of transition, of disruption. And I think what the COVID crisis has done is sort of pushed us all over the edge a little bit, right? So, what does that mean? We need to make a distinction between the things that were systemic and structural issues that we had in the industry versus the issues brought about specifically because of the COVID situation. So I think for starters, the access to capital becomes challenging. There's a lot of projects that about that require, massive amounts of investment capital. I think there will be a much bigger scrutiny of business models, a much better, due diligence on some of these projects, a much better expectation of return, much more expectation of showing real revenues, right, within a shorter runway period. So I think that's going to sort of help to, I would say, filter out some of the more stronger projects from the weaker and more speculative projects. The second thing I would say is that this has also helped us realize as operators that there's a strategic depth in the width of your portfolio. So for example, for SES, we realize, of course, that we have a video business that buffers some of the downsides currently experienced in the business. And I think many operators will look at that and say, look, there's been a lot of sentiment, I would say, around linear video. But in times like this, it does provide you with strategic depth and resiliency in your business, right? So I think that's the second thing we look at as something to reconsider in this post-coronavirus world. And then there's going to be a lot of consolidation. Both, I would say consolidation is something we've always spoken about in the industry. At the operator level, this is probably still challenging, but you see already things in play. Some companies have declared bankruptcy. Some companies are, in quite difficult financial straits. So I think this is going to be something that sort of reshapes the ecosystem around both at the operator level, at the service provider level, that we will see fewer companies, but probably leaner and more efficient businesses.
And so, which sectors do you see that this is maybe more pronounced than others, this consolidation move?
So I would say, clearly, aero is something we all know, right? So it's a knock-on effect. The ASP, the airline service provider, what we call the IFC market, already probably had, I would argue, maybe a bit too many players for what the market they were trying to serve. And of course, it's a scale business, right? So you need to win a lot of airlines. You need to have a lot of CapEx for antenna systems. You need to build out a lot of networks. So I would say structurally, the ASP market was already not in a great place to begin with. Now with airlines not flying, most of the major airlines in the world are down 80-90% in flight traffic. Airlines are simply not flying. And it's unrealistic, I would say, to expect that to completely change overnight, right? So there will be a phased return to air travel. But again, IFC, IFE, this is discretionary spending from the airline passenger, right? It's not a must-have business model. And so this is going to force, I think, some type of realignment in the ASP space. I would say avionics and IFC is probably the one sector that will definitely see some kind of restructuring. And we see some of that already happening.
And maybe a question to Claude. We saw just recently the Chapter 11 situation of Speedcast, a service provider, which was basically sort of going into a situation where they were actually going into consolidation mode, buying all sort of other service provider to be more present in different market segments, to do scaling. But something must have gone wrong along the way. So I don't know if you can comment on the situation.
Don't know the particulars of that, a series of events. There are things that there were signs already that, some of the cash was, running a bit low, and there were also difficulties we had heard about integration. So when you have, I think, a string of 15 acquisitions over a 7-year period, you need to integrate all this into one consolidated organization, which, even if it has many legs to it, has to basically stand on the same ground. And some of it was probably not at the same level as others were. Furthermore, we also know that many of the Speedcast customers, which probably did not help, were in the cruise industry. And we know that that is at a standstill today. So those factors, and a bit like was mentioned, by Nihar, some of those COVID effects were actually compounding what was already there for many organizations. And I fully agree on further integration, further partnerships that can lead to consolidation across the industry in the service provision, as much as the operators themselves. This is the time to really think and rethink models. What Nihar mentioned that is quite correct about this industry is that video is still the cash cow here. We should not forget that. It's not something that went away and then all of a sudden, because OTT, nobody is using video distribution anymore. That's not correct. What is very relevant, though, is the move towards data and IP traffic is giving way to a lot of changes, which you mentioned earlier on. Some of those changes happen in space, but also on the ground. And when we see what's going on the ground right now, there's a lot of movements towards cloud-based services, virtualization of the ground segment. And this is really helping the CapEx picture, because the CapEx pictures right now, as I believe everybody will agree, will have the most delays. People will, organizations will make sure that the market is there, the conditions are there for the market to support those capital investments. And we saw that anything that's really CapEx intensive in satellite is really high risk. And not only high risk, but also prone to delays already. So with this situation that we're living today, the delays are gonna be, I guess, longer. And so therefore, when you look at getting your investment back, then that means your window is stretching too. And there's going to have to be some, I would call them adjustments that will have to be made. But definitely when looking at the bottom line, organizations and companies in the industry already have the conditions to come together and see where the synergies are so that they can, come out of this stronger.
Yeah, and very interesting, this remark. And I think when I listen to both of you, it seems to me that what's I think even more important than ever is that sound operational management and taking care of your business in a sound way is definitely even more important now than maybe it is in free flying times when everything is rosy and wonderful. But I think it also tells me that just simply scaling for the sake of scaling doesn't do the trick. That's not good enough. I don't know if anyone want to comment on that.
Yeah, I would venture that integrating any company, any organization requires time and thoughtful, processing. It's not just saying synergies and we save money. There's always a customer at the other end that's going to ask the question, so who do I talk to now? What is this product? Do you still carry this product? Are there still discounts? Who's my account, manager? And so all very small details like this that in the end, if they're not taken care of, will probably lead to more pain than gain.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So maybe let's move to some sort of slightly related, but still another topic. Over the years, we also have seen this sort of phenomena of talking about old established space and new space. And even though I personally don't particularly like that those terms and this separation, but I think it is true that there is a number of completely new actors that are now in the space sector that were not there a couple of years ago. Be it in the Earth observation front, the navigation, that obviously more downstream, and then also space situational awareness, I think, as a very important topic with all these constellation projects that are coming up. So maybe Claude, if you could start off sort of what are the successful business models that you have seen, and where are the struggles, and how will investors actually look at these companies?
I would say first and foremost, the business models where the company knows its market and knows what it's getting into, not just in terms of technology, but also in market adoption, roadmap for the, deploying services and evolving them, and knowing also basically how to raise money, which is certainly not an easy task. I think investments will continue, albeit at a slower pace. There will be refuge values, sorry. And I think scrutiny on the business cases will be key. If you're looking for a certain level of funding, doesn't matter if it's seed or Series A, B, C, or D, there is money out there, but to get it, I feel that there will be a lot more requirements that are, put on the allocation of that money, simply for the fact that business models, for example, they're a dime a dozen, really, when you think about it. There's so many of them, but even large organizations, large constellations, for example, that we are seeing coming to the market, some of them are really solid. We know what they're going, how they're going to approach the market, how they will sell, distribution, but some we don't really have a clue, and it's difficult. When you kind of scratch your head to see where that is going. But at the end of the day, I agree with you. A lot of new activities. The investors, I think, will still continue to look at them, and probably even more now, because space does have a attraction factor that we're seeing, that we've been seeing over the past few years. That is just, I don't think it's dying out. Of course, large failures, not failures, but anyways, almost failures like OneWeb definitely will have folks wondering if this is a segment that is still worth investing in. But if we continue to track this, and we see a lot of other investments that are, still there. So to me, the business models that will make it the most attractive are the ones that will probably start to generate revenues the quickest.
Okay. But you see still interest in space, maybe less so in SATCOM because of these recent events, but is there still interest in space as you see it, or is it a reticence there?
Yes, there is. But like we said, a few segments are too crowded right now, or very crowded. Like the launch business is very, very crowded. We feel that, there's been a lot of money in that area. And I think downstream applications-oriented companies or small startups will probably have a bit more funding than before, simply for the fact that now that you have the infrastructure, you'll have the infrastructure up in space. What do you do with it? So that's coming.
Yeah. Okay. Nihar, any perspective on this new space phenomena? I mean, we're just seeing a couple of new guys coming into the SATCOM arena. They seem to struggle, frankly speaking. So, what's your perspective there?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite remarkable to me that over the last 4 or 5 years, just the explosion of venture capital and seed financing and early round financing into new space. I know that's probably not the best term, but sort of disruptive technology approaches to space has just skyrocketed, right? So I think the statistic is that 60 to 70% of all that financing was raised over the last 20 years has come in the last 5 years, right? So this is a great sign that there is a lot of innovation in this. But I would agree with Claude that on the infrastructure side, so I think on launchers, on CubeSats, which are probably more capital intensive, there are probably too many players at the moment, and those are quite demanding business models, right? You need to sell hardware and you need to show that revenue trajectory, et cetera. On the application side, which is where a lot of the intelligence is, right? Where there's too many players because the barriers to entry are low, right? So it's more in the analytics game. It's basically leveraging cloud platforms on space situational awareness, IoT, Earth observation. So there are some, this crisis may, it's as I think Churchill said, you don't want to let a good crisis go by without a good solution, good effect from it. So the crisis may actually force discipline into, how do we get the best companies financed on the infrastructure side? What are the business models, as Claude said, that really make sense, which are really solving real customer problems on the application side? And then what comes out is, it's a creative destruction, right? So the companies that are not really with it go away. Companies that are really good survive. And then what you have is a better field of competitors that are going to really make a difference in the future. So I'm optimistic about this sector, news space in general. I think even the older operators have a lot to learn, a lot to incorporate in terms of how agile they are. A lot of the technologies are really revolutionary and can change the way you think. So I think this is going to be a good space. It's going to go through some turmoil, some filtering, I would say, but it's going to come out healthier.
No, it's interesting because it's I think some of the remarks that you just made, Nihar, were also echoed just in the last webinar when investors were talking, basically saying that in the future will definitely be quality over quantity, but scrutiny obviously will be higher. Yeah. And but those that are chosen might actually enjoy still premiums on valuation and the rest of it, because people are more confident with going for them. And I think what was also mentioned as an important factor is obviously the team that you're investing in on top of all the nice business plans and market forecasts. So team is considered crucial and critical to success. So maybe sort of going a little bit away from the pure commercial sector and moving into the more public sector. I think there was a sort of a trend to commercialization of space. And maybe my first question is that trend now continuing? Or is now the sector more relying on public money to survive for the foreseeable future, and the pure commercial efforts will only, take place later again? So that's maybe the first part of the question, and I'm coming afterwards maybe with a second part, which the role of the public sector, is it more an inhibitor, an enabler, or is it actually an accelerator? And there's different angles and views to that. But Nihar, maybe if you start first.
Yeah, sure. It's a very good question. I think without a doubt, after this crisis, the public sector will emerge as a stronger force in the overall space industry. When private capital will be constrained, the public sector is the one that step into the shoes, provide stability, provide assurances, make the right kind of investments, to put down the right kind of incentives to the space industry as a whole. So I think the public sector actually has a very big, very, very big role to play. And it's not necessarily only as an investor, or as an incubator, or as a policy guideline, or as even a customer or investor. It's all of the above, right? So government can play different roles here. I think in particular, Daniel, you mentioned certain technologies the crisis has helped accentuate, as these are very important for situational awareness of governments, right? So you look at tracking the pandemic from an Earth observation standpoint, from a communication standpoint, from a sensor and big data analytics standpoint. Some of these are augmented through space systems. I think governments around the world are realizing, control of that information, interpretation of that information, quick analysis of that information is very, very valuable. So companies that can fit into this niche are going to be viewed as some kind of a critical knowledge base, or critical asset infrastructure, or critical capability. And I think you'll see the governments take steps to ensure that this capability is not lost, this technology is not squandered away, but we give it the ability to survive. So at least that's my view on the government. And I think, in some cases, the government may even step in and say, this is a critical technology. Maybe we step in as an investor. This is also something that's possible. I mean, they're talking about doing that in other industries. Some of the space technologies we're talking about are very critical. So it's not out of the question the government would even do that. But Claude, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with you, because governments were, everybody had all their eyes on the government during this crisis. What can we do? What's the regulation? Are we allowed to do this? Are we not allowed? Who sets the rules? Of course, it's government. So all eyes were on governments during the last 2 or 3 months, even 6 months for some countries. So definitely their role is going to increase, I believe. You talked about imagery and sensing and awareness. I fully agree with you on that one. And furthermore, I think anything that's got an E before it, like e-health, e-learning, e-governance, all these E's, they probably realize that many parts of certain regions or countries still do not have the kind of connectivity that we in urban and suburban areas benefit from. So I believe all these talks, that we saw, a lot of programs and proposals to universal service obligations and things like that were put together before we'll come back. Of course, the realization that, today some of those connectivity issues were blatant in getting the information to some regions and some countries probably will help accelerate this. But as far as, for example, the role that you're mentioning, enablers, yes, very much so. Even tech transfer, we see this a lot in particular, buying the technology, maybe even, taking it, nationalizing. We've seen some nationalization, quote unquote, of technologies or enterprises to avoid them from going under or basically disappearing. So, but the last point I'd like to make is that if the role of government is to be an accelerator, then we will have found really the best way to make use of our public money to actually bring forward a lot of these technologies and access to markets that will be required once we come out of this crisis.
Okay. So we just got a question from the audience also, and I think this is related somehow to the setting up conditions in the new space sector. So the question is, how could governments relieve the rules for new space during such conditions to make it a win-win situation? So I think in some cases, indeed, it's quite complicated actually to get incubators money or to get elected into a startup program and all the rest of it. And so, any views, Claude, of what could be done to actually make it easier for new space to get in? And I mean, I always use the example is like probably Airbus and Lockheed Martin, they have 500 lobbyists in Paris and in Washington, and the new space guy is sort of the last guy in the queue, right? And he doesn't get hurt and attention paid to.
Yeah.
So
I think having a regulatory framework that provides a level playing field is the first thing. And by that, I mean, don't need to have 25 people under contract to write basically what the rules will be for, one activity, for example. And that can certainly help. We've seen a few things just in terms of payments for contracts. We've seen that the US government's done it, the French government's done it, the UK government's done it, accelerating payments on milestones and basically helping with the processes that make it faster, basically, to get the contract. I think those are the few ideas that I can come up with, which offers a win-win situation.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So I wanted to get back to this more important role of the public sector, Nihar. for you as a commercial operator, and I know that from my time in SES, there is always this sort of question about is it friend or enemy for a commercial operator, right? Because it's a lot of more burden to deal with the government to actually do business than with a commercial entity, first of all. And secondly, there's always the danger of taking over things by the public sector that actually should remain in the private sector. And so if you see this gaining importance of the public sector, so how will that rebalance the situation, and how will the commercial operators and businesses work with this?
Yeah, that's always a double-edged sword, right? So I think that, my feeling on this, and, you may think people have mixed views on our current administration in the United States, but I would say one thing I actually agree with what they've done is their approach to space policy in general is to say, look, the government is not here to invent things. The government is not here to pick winners and losers. To Claude's point, we're trying to level the playing field, get undue regulation, bureaucracy out of your way, put in place things that can help you smooth your business, right? But the most important thing the government should do, in my opinion, is to say, this is the problem we want solved. This is the system we want to build. This is the architecture we need. This is the satellite we need. This is the ground systems we need, and specify what is the problem we are trying to solve, and leave it open for open competition. Is what is the most innovative way to solve the problem. So focus on, stating the problem rather than specifying what the solution is. I think that's a really good approach. And, you can already see that. If you look at the way NASA is now, focused on human space flight, they have really moved to a, as a service model, right? So, they let SpaceX and Virgin and Blue Origin develop the systems that they think are the right ones to solve the problem. We want to get back to the moon. We want to get back to Mars, etc. So this approach is a very good one that works hand in hand with the private sector, saying, you guys know how to run this business. You guys know how to do innovation. We are here to A, get out of your way, and B, just say, if you solve this problem for us, we will assure you these many units of purchase, right? So this gives some confidence to the thing. And I think you see that also in the case with the remote sensing industry, where, Department of Commerce has removed regulations that unduly bias, US firms to say, again, create the level playing field. So I think more of that approach, a very pragmatic approach to say, what can government do to incentivize the right stuff? This is the way forward.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe sort of a last topic that I would like to cover is sort of more on the regulatory front, and maybe more talking now at spectrum topics, space traffic management, licensing. There was some recent press I saw about the FCC now imposing rules for deorbiting and making sure that there is not thousands and thousands and thousands more objects in space that are flying uncontrolled around. So what needs to happen on the regulatory front to sort of unleash the potential? We talk now about level playing field sort of on the substance matter of services and products, but what can be done on the regulatory front, on the spectrum front, to sort of ease things up for actors in the space sector? Claude, I don't know, you want to start?
I'm not the expert on spectrum. I think SES is a large player. Will probably have an opinion on that more than I do. But the thing about standardization norms is really could be very helpful. We feel that, you know, when you talk about policy and regulation at the international scale, whenever there was agreements, large, wide-scale agreements on rules, when they were applied, they were successfully applied and without too much, you know, problems. I think when you're mentioning, you know, what I believe is the issue for many, particular constellation operators, is to get that, you know, authorization, to get that first right, to be able to be the first one. That has been, in my view, really productive, because it's the fear of losing something that makes the proponents of those systems advance and advance faster. So therefore, what we've seen in the US and the FCC and also at the ITU, putting deadlines, milestones on how things should advance to be able to use what is still a scarce resource, which is spectrum, we feel that that's always been very positive in a certain way, because it has avoided a whole bunch of what we call paper satellites, you know, fake filings, and the real proponents, or the ones that had at least the most potential to provide something concrete, were the ones that actually, you know, got the approval and got some of the authorizations to launch something. Let's not forget that amongst all of this, there's a whole bunch of other new markets that are emerging that will probably also change the dynamics. If we talk, for example, about in-orbit servicing, you know, and how that fits into the extension of life of certain satellites, so therefore authorizations, you know, and keeping orbital slots. There's a whole bunch of other things that are coming to a head right now. I feel that a lot of this is being addressed. It takes a bit of time, but if it's, let's say, agreed upon on an international scale, I believe that there's greater chances of success, or actually, at least anyways, for the market, which we know today is a global market.
Yeah, no, thank you. But before I go back to Nihar on the spectrum, I would like to pick your brain on maybe the more space traffic management topic that I mentioned, and space situational awareness. I know that you guys have done quite a lot of work on that, and I mean, I see all these, you know, projects, these constellations coming up, but it always seems to me that nobody is thinking about the traffic management in space and the debris management in space. I mean, in the good old times of the GEO world, each satellite controller had the telephone number of his neighbor operator. But if we talk about tens of thousands of satellites flying around, it seems almost to me like I'm flying from Europe to the United States in an airplane without air traffic control. And it's actually quite a scary feeling. So
the industry is in complete denial. We feel that the industry has just, you know, let's not think about this and let's just launch satellites. It's going to be too late if regulation is enacted when things go wrong. We feel that, we've written about this actually just last week. The FCC rules, for example, that came out were a small step in that direction. If you just ask insurers, for example, we had an insurer on a panel, insurers on a panel at the satellite conference in Washington, and some of them are saying we don't insure the first year in LEO anymore. It's just too high of a risk. And so if we start putting those small pieces together, and if we start looking at, you know, a lot of information about tracking is out there, but a lot of it is not out there, and a lot of it is not accessible. And operators, I know for a long time, and geo operators, as part of the Space Data Association, have done a lot of work in that direction. I just don't understand why we're not taking that up one notch, while we're taking up one notch production of satellites, launch of satellites, and operations of satellites. It seems to me it's a natural progression, as you just mentioned, for air traffic, like it was for air traffic. why not space traffic? I just don't understand why people feel that it should be a free-for-all.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. So maybe back to Nihar on the regulatory and spectrum question. What's your perspective on this one?
Well, again, I can't profess to be an expert on the spectrum, so you caught me there. But I mean, in general, I think, you know, it's a tricky situation, I think, for the regulators, because you want to have a regime that is fair and ensures equal access and a level playing field, because that's in the public interest. But at the same time, you don't want to have a regime that stifles what is practical, right? And then, you know, if you allow too much of the former, you would get into the situation, as Claude mentioned, of paper satellites and people warehousing spectrum and just wasting it when it could be put to good economic use. So I think, you know, I can say, I mean, speaking for myself, I mean, economic value of spectrum is an extremely important metric to consider. It's like, how do I maximize that? How do I maximize the public good? And frankly, you know, from the satellite industry perspective, I mean, the regulators have to start looking at, you know, how it is done in other spectrum domains where there's a lot more intelligent spectrum sharing, right? So, you know, right now it's not like you lock down certain chunks and that's yours, that's mine. And why don't we think about it as how can you use the same chunk dynamically, right? And the technology now is actually quite advanced that in many different applications, not in satellite, this is actually done to create more value through intelligent sharing of spectrum. So I think that regulators will also have to start looking at that down the road as technology improves and can do pretty remarkable things now with spectrum. This mindset has to change as well.
Yeah, again, creating a bit more of a level playing field, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think we almost have reached the full hour. So just to the audience, last chance to ask questions to Claude and Nihar. In the meantime, maybe I'm just sort of going through my notes, and maybe I would then invite Nihar and Claude to make some closing remarks as well. I think what we have learned today is there are obviously winners and losers in the current situation, but most of that is more of a accentuation of maybe systemic issues, and that the real operators and the real businesses, they will actually sail through that, maybe a little bit damaged, maybe a little bit bruised, but I think they will come out of that stronger than ever. Nevertheless, there will probably be some consolidation, and I think it was mentioned that probably the aero sector will be one of the ones that could be affected first. But at the same time, I think it's also true that advanced technologies like cloud-based services and virtual networks will actually help to create more efficiencies and proper scaling rather than just sort of hoovering up businesses and hope for the best. In terms of the new space sector, I think clearly quality will win over quantity. So companies who know their markets and have solid business cases will still have a chance to succeed, even though maybe money will be more difficult to grab, even though money is there, but I think it'll be more difficult to grab. And I think one thing important and interesting that we heard is that the gaining importance of the public sector in a positive way. So it's things that will help to develop new technologies, to help new businesses, and it will also, I think, as you put it, Nihar, if governments take a problem-solving view rather than just a prescriptive view, there is also a good opportunity for cohabitation between the commercial and the private, the public sector. I think what's important is a level playing field, and that was mentioned in terms of access to public funding, in terms of standardization, and also in terms of regulation going forward. So I think this was a very interesting discussion. Thanks very much for that. So I would like to give the floor to Claude, and then afterwards to Nihar for some final messages that you would like to pass on.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Good summary. And there's one word that I wrote on my sheet here, which actually made me think that the COVID-19 is a disruption. It's a huge disruption. And if we think that our industry was in a disrupting state before COVID-19, well, right now, this is the real disruption. This is it's a global one. And so therefore, I think our disruption is manageable. Let's put it this way. I think we can certainly come out of this one stronger. And if everything that we've been living through over the past 2 or 3 months, the majority of businesses are still alive, I have a good feeling for the future.
Thank you, Claude. Nihar, your final last words?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, thanks for that great summary, Daniel. And, thanks also to you and Fabrice for organizing this. I mean, these kinds of exchanges, I think, are really good for our industry to cross pollination of ideas. So, what I think is that the crisis is going to be extremely disruptive. I think we all know that, but the more important thing is let's make it count, right? So it's going to be super painful. There are going to be companies that don't make it. There are going to be some companies that make it. The resilient ones will make it. But I think a crisis is a time to reflect and say, okay, what is really important? What are we really good at? How do we run this business efficiently? And what are the applications or technologies we can invest in that will make sense? And use it to refocus, use it to restructure. Both at a structural level, at a macroeconomic perspective, that will happen, I would say, more naturally, because that's the nature of industry, nature of capitalism. But I think also at a firm level, it's a good time to reflect on what do we need to do right? Because I think in the past, we all said that the industry has been in some difficulty and some transition, but we never really collectively managed to say, okay, we're making certain changes, sort of muddled through that situation. The crisis puts it to a head. So this is the time to act and act decisively.
Thanks, Nihar, for this. Thanks very much. So with this, I would like to thank, first of all, the speakers, Claude and Nihar, for this fantastic insights. Thanks for that. Thanks for the audience for listening in. Also, thanks to Emanuele and Veronica for organizing these webinars. And as I said in the beginning, this is not the last one, so there's a couple more to come. The next one will be tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock Central European Summer Time. And it's entitled From Big Picture to Down to Earth. And we will have, again, 2 very exciting speakers. We'll have Alexander Misurkin, who is a 2 times commander of the ISS, and Slava Turishev, which is a senior scientist at NASA's JPL. And the gentleman will talk about the experiences, and particularly Alexander can give us a view from space down to the Earth, but also all the work that he's doing and has been doing when he was in space, and the impact that actually may have on a lot of technology and economic aspects down on Earth. So I'm looking forward to that discussion, and I hope many of you will join as well. So thanks with that. Thanks very much. Have a nice evening and a nice day.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Bye.
Bye.